This is the most terrifying video I've ever made, and I do genuinely mean that. You'll see why. I'm best known for my prediction that America is on the verge of a civil war. I was incorrect in predicting that we'd start seeing mass violence last year. The thing is that the outside world largely mirrored my underlying thesis that America could fall into a civil war on a knife's edge. Both right and left-wing pundits have talked about an impending civil war as it became a normal talking point. Practically every major left-wing pundit has openly, or are in the only most thinly veiled way possible, saying that it's acceptable to murder right-wingers for their political opinions. Former presidential candidate Hillary Clinton has said that Republicans should be sent to re-education camps. Leftist think tanks openly shadowbox launching a coup, and there has been mass murders or attacks against either Tesla owners or Doge employees. It used to be that people would mock me for saying that we're on the verge of a civil war. No one does that now. This really then begs the question, why haven't we had a civil war already? I've already made half a dozen videos laying out my argument for why I believe we could have a civil war, so I won't go for that now. I sourced my argument from a variety of historic cycles or computer models, which have historically been proven to be able to predict when societies have revolutions or civil wars. I've been on this for a while where I've thought America would have a civil war since 2020, given I've read a lot of books on the topic that said that. COVID also showed how thin the veil of sanity or societal functioning really is. We've all tried to shove COVID under the rug to forget it happened, but you realistically have to see it as a foreshadowing of what's going to come next. Not to say that we're going to have another plague, although that's not out of the question, but rather how easily the government or your own neighbors can become staggeringly tyrannical or insane if given the slightest excuse. I think I've found the answer for why we haven't had a civil war yet. The horrible thing is the reason is so much vastly worse than what I thought it would be initially. It's similar to how when you turn over a log in the forest, you'll find maggots eating it out. When I studied this topic, the variable that I was missing made everything appear so much worse. Let's not waste any time and get into the thick of it. Part 1. The Two Crises. I've said for years that I believe the industrial world is facing two distinct crises at once, which have fused into a single event which we're going to have to deal with. The problem is that each of these events have different roots, but they've become inextricably fused. It reminds me of how Strauss and Howe made their generational cycles in the 1990s that predicted that America would hit what they called the fourth turning in the 2020s. This was the first time in American history that their parallel economic and political cycles would crash at once, thus making it the most dangerous era of American history so far. My friend Balaji says that we're currently seeing 4 different cycles of American history converging. Then imperial dynasties tend to last 250 years, as best articulated by Peter Turchin recently, but with authors going back centuries ago like Tytler also saying it. This is the year America turns exactly 250 years old, which is pretty spooky. If you want to get a little more woo-woo, we're currently in the shift of astrological ages from the age of Pisces to Aquarius. The ancients put enormous stock into stuff like that. It's difficult to be able to try to explain to people why they should articulate 2 separate lines of causation in a society where most people want to blame complex events on a single scapegoat. Trying to get the public to talk about things like structural demographic variables or long-term biological processes often feels nigh impossible. But at their core, These are what I believe the causes to be. Those two crises are firstly the secular cycle, which authors like Peter Turchin or David Hackett Fischer wrote about. These are 250-year regime shift cycles, with earlier examples in Western history being the French Revolution, the 30 Years' War, or the Black Death. These occur when the world changes while the old ruling class grows corrupt. This then precipitates wars, plagues, and famine as a growing pain before the society can transmute from older to newer forms. Meanwhile, the second crisis is Mouse Utopia, or an alternate name I've developed is the psychological Black Death. I've made a video analyzing Mouse Utopia that you can watch if you want to know more. Mouse Utopia was an experiment run repeatedly in the 60s and 70s about how to test for what the consequences of exponential population growth are. Calhoun ran the experiment over 30 times, and in each case, they put 9 mice into a cage that could hold 6,000. The mouse population balloons to over 2,000, and then the colony fails in the same ways. You saw a complete breakdown of the mouse social structure, where ironically, the mice do have a society built off reciprocal social relations in the same manner that humans do. Much like us, the mice are totally dependent on their colonies, where failure means total death. I remember when I read the experiment having it click for the first time in my mind that the only thing holding our highly complex advanced society together is a series of social relationships between people. If those fall apart, we'll all die and lose all of the trappings of the modern world. Meanwhile, our society doesn't study or value these social ties at all. The mice saw a breakdown of their sexual polarity, with female mice becoming masculine and male mice effeminate. Mother mice would mistreat their young, so they'd be incapable of functioning as an adult, while the mice lost any ability to have relationships. The mice had different fail-safe methods, between some becoming autistic and losing the ability to follow social cues. Mice have specific mating rituals, which when the mice stopped following them, they lost the ability to mate. For this reason, every time the experiment was run, it caused the mouse birth rate to collapse to 0, and the mouse colony would totally go extinct with no survivors. Not a single mouse survived these. Other mice became sociopathic and violent. They would murder the mice that chose to live. There were homeless mice who would wander in the middle of the colony before getting attacked or killed by the sociopath mice. The last mice to stay sane were the alpha male mice who died protecting their harems, which is how mice mate. The other groups of mice who stayed sane were the tunneler mice. The only mouse form of creativity is making tunnels or balls of dirt. The mice, much like humans, offshore their ability to maintain sanity or think to the group. The tunneler mice maintained sanity by avoiding socializing and instead doing their hobbies. They would obsessively make these balls of dirt and these complex tunnel systems, which allowed them to avoid the madness by living in their own tunnels away from the group. They were ultimately killed as well, though. The tunnelers and the alphas maintained sanity the longest, Calhoun guessed, because he found that the core cause of mouse utopia was the loss of agency, social roles, and thus meaning. It's crazy to think that these are still completely vital to mice, so much so that they die without them, which really shows how many traits that we see as being vitally human are really animal. The alphas had their harems to protect, and the tunnelers had their hobbies. The end point of mouse utopia is total collapse and atomization, with the mice going crazy due to the overcrowding brought about by the population increase. Mice start hiding and isolating in their own areas to avoid the constant chaos and disorder of the other mice. Once the atomization hits a tipping point, the mice had no way to protect themselves against the gangs of evil murderous mice, where the one thing that could still unify people in the absence of scarcity was envy. It's sad that even the mice can't avoid the Marxists. For those who have had to live through the last few years, the comparisons of Mouse Utopia to our world should be totally obvious and undeniable. I'm not even going to try to go through the obvious comparisons, since I already did that in my previous Mouse Utopia video. I'm trying to avoid this video being a rehash of that one, where this is more so a video to catch us up on the recent events. Suffice it to say that probably the easiest examples of similarities are that wokeness and especially environmentalism are nearly perfect Mouse Utopia ideologies. That since wokeness is about attacking any group that succeeds and thus rerouting resources to groups that don't, which will not change the underlying structural reasons for why they did not succeed. The top term for Mouse Utopia is the behavioral sink, and I see these behaviors as if you're just flushing money and social capital down the drain into a sink. Environmentalism is such a perfect rationalization for the sink, since it takes something that could be reasonable, where if you go to China or India, it's very clear why environmentalism could exist in abstract, but then the logic behind environmentalism can be used to politically push for measures that can end civilization. We can see these trends taking place in North Europe right now, where Germany getting rid of its nuclear power plants and replacing it with coal doesn't make sense inside an environmentalist perspective, but makes total sense from a Mouse Utopia destroying civilization for its own sake perspective. I heard about how Nantes in France was going to build an airport and the local environmentalists were trying to shut it down since they were building it on swampland and farms. That made me think, you understand that that's not valuable pieces of land, right? I want you to get rid of the swamps. What all of this means is that around the world, and not just in the West, due to the global popularity of socialism, the evil envious mice run the governments. That means that these types of regimes will either actively push for Mouse Utopia or not be willing to take measures against it. Part 2. What I got wrong. When I predicted that we'd have a revolution or a civil war, I said that these events were completely certain except for one caveat, that being that Mouse Utopia was so far advanced that society was about to totally collapse anyway. The reason I said that is that from the Civil War or revolutionary analysis, that every variable was already in motion to a degree that you couldn't stop. This is what Peter Turchin said when he predicted a civil war in the mid-2020s, writing around 2010, that you would have to change decades of history leading up to that point, where even in 2010 it was certain. When both sides have rhetoric where they currently are, and the entire government or society divided up, you have an enormous pressure towards conflict without any real pressure towards unity. You need an equivalently large pressure in forces like this to stop these historic trajectories. The thing is that we have something that big, which proved to be even greater than I expected. I don't feel bad for getting my prediction wrong. Looking back on it, I see that I did all of my analysis correctly, but we ended up in the fringe timeline, which I used as a caveat, but I didn't think was likely. One of my least favorite, quote, logical games that people do is they pretend whatever does happen is destined to occur, while arguing for anything else is insane. I remember when I was a teen and I was watching an alternate history YouTube channel that said that the US could never have conquered Canada in the War of 1812, even though we had 10 times Canada's population at the time. The timeline we are currently in is already staggeringly improbable, where the Industrial Revolution or modern technology are improbable in themselves, where the average historic society was basically peasants living in their own filth. Leftism is also staggeringly incorrect by any historic standard, and the fact that our shared social beliefs are this incorrect already doesn't really make any sense, since 99.9% of human societies in history would say that the things we believe as a society are just completely insane. Doing these sorts of predictions are profoundly difficult since I have to model how the entire world works, given the way these things operate is that a litany of different variables can change the trajectory, not just the variables you're measuring or are aware of. This is why technocracy and social engineering always fails on such a staggering level. These are often driven by unpredictable variables. In many cases, the thing that changes the equation you're looking at is what Nassim Taleb calls black swans, which are unpredictable variables that ironically occur with relative statistical frequency. This is why I say that my job is betting against God, and I don't fault myself for getting this stuff wrong. I challenge any of my critics to get a better predictive record than me, and here's a text wall of all the predictions I got right. It's better to have a culture where we encourage people to take risks than one where we just hide in the corner. Also, my attitude towards these things is that I change my worldview every year with new information, and my worldview is an open source code, which I'm constantly testing or feeding new inputs into. What happened here is that a handful of variables I wasn't tracking crystallized to make Mouse Utopia vastly worse than I expected initially. Mouse Utopia, over the last few years, was able to radically surge in importance. We're still going to have a civil war, in my opinion. It's just that Mouse Utopia is going to become the dominant variable around the world soon. It's similar to how the Black Death during the crisis of the 14th century became the most important event around the world, but you still have political crises like the 100 Years' War or the fall of Mongol China occurring at the same time as the Black Death. Mouse Utopia has grown so rapidly that it's eating literally every other variable in the society, and it will soon kill all of us if we can't change direction. We're stuck in a uniquely weird position as a society due to the internet, screen addiction, the baby boomers, and feminism or wokeness that allows us to get to the edge of a civil war, but then not actually cause one. Then what happens is that Mouse Utopia becomes the main instigating variable, which allows a civil war-like conflict to emerge. I will unpack how the timeline we're currently in was practically designed by God to make the society involved look as pathetic as possible. As I said in my recent video on my second YouTube channel, History 102, with my video on the age of the last men, Nietzsche predicted that this would occur in the 19th century. He said that the society of the 21st century would be so horrifyingly complacent, nihilistic, envious, and pathetic as to become a benchmark for thousands of years for what we should avoid as a species. That is where we're stuck now. The good thing is that Nietzsche predicted that the last men would lose and that their society would collapse. Screen addiction is an enormous variable here which creeped in on us at the exact worst moment. It's hard to overstate how negative the consequences of screen addiction are. I've spent over a year trying to decenter myself from the internet, and I've been largely successful. I've developed my own system to manage screen addiction, which I'll make a video on this channel explaining soon. However, what I learned in the process is that screen addiction has consumed nearly everyone, while it's not really an option anymore. Screen addiction is practically mandatory now if you want to be a member of society. The trick the society does, where they'll give you a bad social product, like bad quality food, politics, or school, and say that if you don't like it, you can go somewhere else, is horrible, since the industrial system is so centralized that there really isn't another option, so you're just stuck with their bad quality product that they're totally unwilling to take responsibility for. One of the worst elements of Mouse Utopia is the atomization. The mice die when they become totally isolated and atomized. What screen addiction has done is radically increase the negative effects of atomization for obvious reasons. The screens are designed to keep us constantly hooked on very short-term stimuli. Almost no human can compete with that on a lizard brain level, since real relationships are complex and often slow or messy. Shallow relationships feel hollow and don't provide the same role control on a physiological animal basis. Humans need deep relationships in order to be able to live at all, and we legitimately, on a medical basis, have severe health effects for not having them. Loneliness cuts off as many years of your life as smoking cigarettes does. Another element of the mouse utopia atomization with screen addiction is that you have to see screen addiction as like abusing a drug, in that it puts people into an altered psychological state, which you can't compare to a normal sober person. As I've said before, I'm going to make a video on this topic soon, but it's hard to overestimate how much the internet is coloring society today. I only realized this as I tried to distance myself from screen addiction, and then it started changing how I thought, where I started to remember and revert back to the version of myself I was as a child before I had the internet. This addiction is true even for baby boomers and older people who are still addicted to their screens. Everyone is so addicted to their screens that they don't even realize how much it's affecting them already. The reason I say that is that all of the social or political trends today are downstream from the internet. The cable news stations still hold the legitimacy and the money, but the real cultural shifts or innovations stem from the internet. Every single major trend or event today is internet provoked because people are legitimately not going outside enough to spark trends in the real material reality. People will tell me to touch grass, and I'm sure I spend much more time in nature on a more frequent basis than any of these people, but there is no actual physical place to do things anymore. If young people want to form political groups, and I'm very active in the Texas right-wing youth scene, there aren't really many options to do so. There's no third places for young people to meet or hang out. The only thing that I've found works is using the internet to organize people to meet up in person. I'm so angry that everyone is addicted to screens, and we're so complacent that we don't even really talk about it. There's no social institutions to help deal with screen addiction. There's no recognition that this is an issue, or social codes to help people be less addicted to their screens. It only makes sense if we're in the age of the last men. The only people I really see who talk about screen addiction are those who work in the tech industry, who see how the sausage gets made enough that they know about the negative consequences. I think we should all do our bit to lessen the addiction, but I'm also aware that lots of people, myself included, are dependent on work that requires using a screen, while every other vector of life has become mediated by screens, whether social, personal, entertainment, or even sexual. I think if screen addiction somehow vanished as a variable tomorrow, that we'd have a civil war. That's since what the internet algorithms and addictions do is hook people up to these giant egregores, which is a term for a collective group spirit, that are radically conformist. The reason that the internet these days is so sterile and boring is that since everyone's online, no one is having experiences outside which they could bring to the internet to be genuinely entertaining. The only thing people talk about are either things that are online, or in person they'll talk about those internet trends, and none of this has any relationship to reality. All of this evolves into becoming some fourth level abstracted simulacrum of life. The digital culture also prizes conformity, insincerity, envy, and cruelty. These become psychological drives in their own right, and since people don't have lives outside their screens, then the biases implicit in these algorithms just become the new reality. People don't have enough objectivity to know how addicted they already are. At the same time, the screens suck up every extra moment, so they have no mental energy or time to think objectively to realize what's going on. This means it's impossible to organize people, since the internet attacks anyone who is sincere in trying to fix things. The internet is so toxic and envious that it traps everyone in these low-trust games where nothing gets accomplished, but at the same time it uses psychological manipulation and constant dopamine to stop people from taking a step back and putting all the pieces together. The reason that all the presidential candidates candidates for 2028 are reruns of older ones, while there are no new candidates which represent the changing society, is that the internet destroys anyone who tries to form genuine leadership. The internet has chewed up practically all of its formerly loved pundits, such as Jordan Peterson, Andrew Tate, Ben Shapiro, Destiny, Vaush, or Hassan. The only reason I'm still around is I actively avoid you and everything you say. I literally do whatever the opposite of what the internet mob tells me to do, and it works quite well. When I realized that most of the internet would cheer on my death, it radically changed how I perceived this entire equation. This all adds together to keep the entire population entranced in a drug-induced spiral with no release or way to organize. The average digital person is stuck being constantly stimulated with no resolution or depth. They feel constantly disassociated and as if they're living in a dreamlike state where nothing feels real. The way the digital mob works is that they're incentivized to lead people to the point of violence, but have no ability to organize it. That's why these pundits keep on saying it's okay to kill people, but then the murders are caused by lone gunmen, since the internet has radically made the mouse utopia atomization worse. The second element here that I didn't model correctly was how well wokeness would work, even among the right. I could see that the right was pushing back against the left in the last few years. Elon buying Twitter was really a tipping point here. However, what I've found is that the new right is by and large similar to the left in general psychology. It's also important to say that the left comes with all of these implicit assumptions like equality or consensus or these very feminine mindsets that would not exist in another era of history and make mouse utopia more difficult to deal with because all of those things push towards the behavioral sink. I want to make this video a sort of skeleton key for the next series of videos I'm making, where I also need to make a video on the new right with its core issues. The right has proven itself to be profoundly pathetic in a way that I didn't think was even possible. I was operating under the assumption that the right would start to process the left as an existential threat once Trump was elected, since they clearly are. You could look to Europe, the other Anglo diasporas like Canada or Australia, as well as even Brazil or the rest of the world, to see that if the left is allowed even a little bit more power, they will jail their opposition and crack down on the right, carrying out the demographic suicide of the Western world. We see these trends even within America, and the right said that when Trump was elected, they were aware of these dangers. Trump was able to form a coalition with RFK and Elon that bridged everyone except the left. After that, none of these variables held together. Trump is starting Middle Eastern wars while alienating his support base among the right-wing youth, since they voted for him to help on the domestic issues that they're really hurting with, which he has not really helped with. I'm not forgetting all of the positive things Trump has done so far, and I'm still grateful, but most of the young conservatives I know are turning on the regime. I've heard about plenty who are going to vote for the left, since they hope that the left will just cause total social collapse to speed this up, which I think is a terrible idea. The baby boomers, and this still includes the conservatives, seem totally unwilling to accept the scale of the issues. This is a huge problem, which I could also make into a video, but the boomers are totally willing to ignore the demographic future extinction of their societies, and that's not an exaggeration from the statistics, how the vast majority of Americans live in de facto poverty, how AI is about to get rid of millions of jobs, mass immigration, insane costs of housing, and dozens of other issues. Trump starting a war in the Middle East proves that he thinks that these are issues that can be dealt with by good PR, but they're not. These are very deep, intractable issues that will totally destroy America within a few years, if not fixed. The clock is already ticking, since if the left gets the presidency once again, they can use it to erode the organic spirit of America enough just to break our will as a nation. A lot of the boomer cons basically have the same worldview as leftists, and it's remarkable how so many boomer conservatives in the Senate will openly not block the left on things like voter ID, not stopping immigration, or not taking wokeness seriously. I think the baby boomers got offered the deal when they were young that they'd never have to inconvenience themselves in the slightest for the greater good, and they pulled out that promise for the young. When I was growing up, the main messaging was abuse from the left for my skin and genitals, so we never got offered that post-war deal. Now the boomers are trying to pretend that they've always been good, upright Victorians, so they can turn the young into slaves. It's disgusting, and they seem totally willing to let their country die before they even acknowledge what's going on. At the same time, much of the right-wing youth are super feminine. It's disgusting to watch where they engage in all of this victim behavior. This is not a manly or virile way to live. Going back over the last few years, it's really remarkable how much time we've wasted on the Jews. I understand, especially so with Epstein and the war with Iran, that there are serious questions about Israel's control of the government, but none of the discourse over the last few years has been in any way productive or helpful. If we hypothetically killed all of the Jews, it would solve none of the issues I've just mentioned. Even if the Jews created them, which I don't think they did, they've evolved to become variables in their own right that need to be fixed for what they are. Blaming the Marxists would make a lot more sense here, but really, these are issues that need work to fix. They need to be taken seriously. And it's even more gross that there are plenty of young men who would be happy to fix them, where not all of the young right-wing men are this feminine, but they've been blocked from any social mobility by the left. Part of the age of the last men is undercutting anyone with agency or drive, so we can all drown in the behavioral sink together. It's insane that the only thing the digital youth right seem to care about is the most obnoxious and retarded status games. They constantly take turns shitting on me, and I am one of the very few people who could actually help them. Their top criticisms of me are that I'm ugly, autistic, and a loser who's not right-wing enough. None of that's even true, which means they're really just dumb and spoiled children squawking to make noise. None of this is useful either, and will just allow the left to totally destroy society. They clearly have no masculine role models in their life who would show them how to lead, organize, and develop coherent ideas. They are so weak I don't even take them seriously, since they will bend to any genuine right-wing authority that emerges because they've already done that so many times to various strongmen. None of this makes sense unless you assort for one variable. In a rational, reasonable world that follows the rules that we have seen play out over all of human history, you would see people panicking now. The right and the left would be able to watch all of these events occurring and start to realize that this is very, very bad. The fact that they haven't means that their nervous systems aren't working. My friend Uberboyo has talked about how leftists have the part of their brain that assorts for threat detection turned off. I have PTSD, so the exact opposite thing happened to me, which is why I find these people completely incomprehensible. When I realize that these people are pure materialists who can only think through terms of what they can see or touch, it horrified me. I assumed that everyone was capable of looking at the statistical trends or the news, then adding up everything going on to see that this was a very bad situation that just hasn't hit a critical threshold yet. That's always how these historic crises work, where things are stable until they're not, and then the shadow comes pouring out. However, we've never taught people how to think rationally, where most people, and this is exacerbated by the internet, only think through social approval. They also only think in things that they can physically see. It then clicked. If I wasn't capable of abstract thought, and I only pieced things together from what I saw, then this reality would appear invincible. Things just work for most people, and they have no concept about why or how they work. I then realized that most people see the system of industrial civilization as a sort of god that just works. Questioning it is stupid, since of course it works, and it's even disloyal. That made me realize that we're totally fucked, since the people involved physically cannot understand what I'm trying to convey, since they can't process things they can't see. I looked it up, and only about a quarter of the population processes the world in abstract concepts. That made me realize that everyone will just walk into Mouse Utopia without lifting a finger, since only when Mouse Utopia hits a tipping point will they realize how bad it is, and it will already be too late by that point. By that threshold, they'll have already built their entire identity around the system working and will have no other frame. At that point, they'll either give up or they'll die. This is all exactly what happens in the Mouse Utopia experiment. Calhoun calls it the first death, when the mice lose their soul and inner life before they start killing one another. They stop processing their environment and become empty. Their nervous systems stop working. I have a term called the frost, which is the force of social alienation, which causes people's nervous systems to stop working in Mouse Utopia. Keep in mind that society mediates us a lot more than we think. So when the other people around us stop mirroring complex emotions, we stop feeling them. Throw on top of this digital addiction, and Mouse Utopia is literally shutting off our ability to be human or feel on a basic level. We need constant stimuli from people around us so that we can be happy, horny, patriotic, or curious, since those things don't really belong to us as individuals, but are archetypes we get from our surroundings. The conclusion I came to is that most people today are not functionally awake. That's the only way to explain their behavior up to this point. As I'll say further on, it's even more exacerbated on a macro-social or political level. The reason that we're willing to do all of these really dumb maneuvers is there's not really anything behind the eyes making decisions. They've offshored their ability to think to the algorithm and social conformity. That's why the other side comes across as deeply mentally ill, since they are, where the only thing that's mediating their behavior is the hive mind. I've developed my own system to avoid this, which I'm going to make a video about soon. Don't worry, I'm here for you and I'm not going to go away soon. What this means is that people are too far gone to be able to realize what's happening or to stop Mouse Utopia. The first death is over. Time for the second. Part 3, the total failure of authority. The core thing that stopped us from having a civil war was the failure of the ties that stretch from authority to people. There has been a complete severing between the leadership class and the population, thus destroying the ability for any group to be able to militarily organize on a large scale. The Israel-Gaza war was really important here, where it shattered the coalitions both inside the right and the left. I only realized this looking backwards, since the war never really mattered much to me, but it was the defining event of digital politics for years, frying almost every public figure on the topic. The right is divided between the anti-Semites and the boomer cons, while moderates are sidelined. The reality here is that the mob doesn't want to solve problems, but likes to destroy people, and the Israel-Gaza war was a convenient tool for that, because it's too far away to actually implicate us in being responsible for it, but is emotionally loaded enough that it can be a useful tool to destroy your rivals. The mob's main desire is the destruction of people, including its own heroes. Mouse Utopia is crabs in the bucket or mate suppression on an industrial scale, so it tracks with everything else we know. For example, if Trump were to start a war with the left, it's unclear if the right-wing young men would fight for him. The same holds for the DNC and the rabid leftist youth. Every other social authority has failed. Churches have failed at attracting the type of young men who could fight, and the same thing as all of the other public figures. There is literally no cause or organization that could convince people to fight for them, since all the leadership have totally betrayed the young people, leaving them with nothing. No work, housing, mate, friends, nation, or belief structure. I was once talking to an older friend who said he didn't like how black-pilled young people are, and I told him young people literally have nothing to do or have rather than be black-pilled. The fact that the mainstream narrative won't acknowledge any of this on any level, still pretending we're in the 20th century, only makes sense through the lens of Mouse Utopia. Power is held together as much by the belief in power than by guns themselves. Even the most brutal regimes in history were only able to hold on to power by being able to appeal to a certain demographic of the population to maintain their right to rule. Saddam Hussein appealed to the Sunnis, and Hitler was popular among most Germans. No military force can genuinely hold a population down if the entire public decides to resist. What the boomers have effectively done through eroding faith in the institutions and any higher moral virtues, where the boomers have spent decades attacking patriotism, God, duty, honor, or manhood, is they've removed any force that will stop them from getting murdered in mass utopia. In most industrialized countries, the population is about 90% urban, while around 80% of Americans live near major metropolitan areas. The left has spent years eroding the confidence of the police, so much so that if there were large riots and murders in major cities, that literally no one would stop them. There is nothing that stops mobs from burning down America's largest cities. If the mobs get too big, the police, in many cases, already have orders telling them to not fire on them, and they're going to give up since the apparatus of law, which is often controlled by the left, will not defend them. It's only a matter of time until a mob realizes this, and America, or the world in general, is a deeply unequal and unhappy place. This type of agitation is also a form of social organization that can translate over from the internet very easily, since the internet already makes huge, hateful mobs. We can see that this has already occurred in recent years, where enormous left-wing mobs have already launched secession movements in major cities multiple times, while nearly every major American city has already had leftist politically motivated mobs. The left has spent years eroding the loyalty and discipline of the military, especially so through putting leftists in positions of authority. Wokeness is totally at odds with military life or values, so this causes social atomization or loss of faith in the military as an institution. The young people I've spoken to in the military have recently said that it's deeply demoralized and mentally ill. The government has not done a good job of keeping the soldiers in good morale and motivated. They're young men who are the most abused demographic in the country. This makes it hard for me to believe that if you told the military to fire on the mob in major American cities, that they would shoot their own countrymen to defend a regime that couldn't care less about them. It's also deeply unclear if the government wouldn't betray soldiers who were ordered to fire on the mob anyway. This is how revolutions like the Russian or French as examples have started. Once the ruling regime loses the loyalty of the military, who is unwilling to shoot on the mob, the bluff of centralized power totally collapses. The country is already barely holding together. Nothing works anymore. I'm refraining from a 2-minute rant about every single service I've tried to buy in the last few months that no longer works. Not a single industry that I know of in modern America is healthy or functional. They're all utterly dysfunctional, and it's not easy to solve because this is caused by very complex human factors that require an enormous cultural shift to fix. Fixing this requires pulling on things like religion, a comprehension of human nature, or moral values that our society has actively spent decades trying to crush. A huge part of mass utopia is the society removing the traditions or skills that could stop it. The reason that our ancestors and practically every culture that has ever existed has valued tradition in culture so much is that you have to train people for their entire lives to know how to operate in these complex cultural systems so you don't get this outcome. And you can't just flush your culture down the drain for a century and then be surprised when you see consequences like this. It's so aggravating that people just make shit up and that they espouse these theories that everyone else in history would think are utterly psychotic. And then when they have the consequences that would be totally self-evident if they were operating within a sane cultural frame. They're totally shocked. The fundamental reality is that we have brought this on ourselves, and we totally deserve what we're about to get. The food where I live in Texas now is utterly disgusting. It's getting to be a majority of the food in grocery stores, and everywhere I go, the food is bad. It's disgusting where I've thrown up so many times, and I've had my stomach go sick. As I record this, my right-hand man is currently sick due to food poisoning. At this point, I test everything I eat where I'll take a bite and then wait 5 minutes. The reason that people don't notice is that they eat quickly, and the corporations use chemicals to mask the taste. The frost is already eroding their sense of taste. My mom thought this would happen when I was a child, and so she would train me on tasting different levels of food quality. She would give me artisanal German beer as a teen, and she said that it was so that the college beers would be too disgusting for me to drink them. Most people's gut bacteria adjusts to the rotting food, which is really a symbol for all of this. My dad flew down to Texas, and he said he didn't believe me until he saw this food, but it was the most disgusting he had ever seen in the world. The reason that the food is bad is pure mouse utopia. That the government regulations shut down free farmers, making it exorbitantly expensive to become a new farmer. This means that most farmers now are old and retiring, with no new generation to replace them. America is in the middle of a huge beef shortage, where we have less total cows than 1961, when we had about half the population we currently do. I was talking to a local butcher who told me that due to this shortage, we're importing beef from Latin America, including countries like Peru, Guatemala, or Venezuela that have little to no quality control. That's why so much of the meat is disgusting now. It feels deeply unfair that this is occurring in a first world country, which is wealthy enough to fix this immediately. The fact that something this bad, this big is happening, and no one is reporting on it should be the canary in the coal mine, that the entire system is really bad, but the authorities are covering it up. The number one thing the system should provide is good food. The American food system is also hyper-centralized, supposedly for regulatory reasons, but other countries, including wealthy first world European ones, don't have this, which proves that this is really about power. The centralization of food processes and distributors mean that if a handful go bad, so does the entire country. Even the canned food is bad now, which is a really bad sign. Another thing is that the food industry is largely staffed by illiterate illegal migrants who might not even understand what they're doing and have no stake in the society or the quality of their work. Assume that when someone does a job that's very clearly incorrect, where, as an example, my packages often don't arrive now from the mail. If you zoom out on a broader national level, it's the same failures. The US government is in deadlock. We were already in a bad place where the right and the left were constantly fighting over the US government beforehand. State governments going against the federal authority, government departments going against Trump, and the Senate constantly fighting over politics while not solving anything. Trump has already sent soldiers to stabilize left-wing cities against him multiple times for rioting. We're starting a Middle Eastern war that's unpopular with both the left and a lot of the right, which will create a crisis of legitimacy. This war will not be solved cleanly or easily, which means it will keep compounding, while it would not surprise me if America sends ground troops to open up the Straits of Hormuz. There are a few very serious dangers here. For one, the left has already been filibustering any decision in the Senate until Trump backs down on using ICE to deport illegal immigrants. That's not going to happen since it's the key platform he ran on. The left is also shutting down changes due to the Iran war. Trump is asking for billions of dollars to be sent for this Iran war, while the US is already in some of the worst debt of any era ever in human history. There is no chance we will ever be able to pay this off, and it will destroy our currency sooner or later. A budget crisis caused by a foreign war is what caused both the French Revolution and the English Civil War. As of now, the government shutdown that occurred a few months ago hasn't actually been solved, where plenty of federal departments between the IRS, TSA, Air Traffic Control, the Postal Service, and the Department of Defense are not being paid. These are huge and necessary parts parts of the government. As of now, these are not going to be patched up, and the more Trump pushes for the war, the more he'll alienate coalitions that he could use to fix stuff like this. My predominant concern here is not the war in itself, but the downstream effects. For example, Iran has threatened to cut off the Straits of Hormuz, which they surround on 3 sides, while 1/4 of the world's oil supply moves through it. Outside of North America, the price of oil has already skyrocketed. Oil is an inelastic commodity, which means that shifts like this cause huge downstream fluctuations in the price of oil. Oil is the bedrock of the entire global system, where if its price goes up, so does the price of everything. The food system is totally dependent on oil prices, which means that the food issues I spoke about are about to get a lot worse. The global system is held together by a shared bluff, which the boomers don't realize how fragile it is, if and when it will all come crashing down. For example, every major country in the world has been going through the most egregious money printing event ever in human history since COVID. The reason it hasn't totally shattered their economies is that everyone is so complicit that it all equals out to a shared increase in water pressure. Western Europe and China are against the Iran war, and so if there's a severing of trust, that could destroy the global cartel maintaining this. The American dollar has been stretched to its limits by this money printing, and its confidence is held up by a bluff. Epstein and the elite being mass implicated in pedophilia is another variable here, which has caused a massive loss of faith in the ruling regime, which has not yet had serious consequences, but it likely will. Things that important don't lead to nothing. They just take time to work through sometimes. The baby boomers have built their entire right to rule around money and the economy. What happens when that fails? Money could be very close to having no value, and in a world where money is the only thing left after the erasure of every moral value or loyalty, that then means total social collapse. It's really a wonder that the stock market has been stable ever since COVID, while most people have been living in a de facto Great Depression. It's due to manipulation and money printing. The stock market is literally broken since there aren't enough deviators from the group strategies to rebalance it. What happens to ecosystems like that when they haven't been stress tested against their environment is that they totally collapse when put under pressure. All of these things are connected to mean that even an emotional loss of faith in authority could mean a total collapse of civilization. What I've also found is that no country in the world is prepared or equipped to deal with this. If you look at Europe or South America or Asia or Africa, all of the industrial countries are having the exact same issues, and all of their elites are complicit in not solving this. What this means is that when America, as the global hegemon, has a loss in confidence, it's going to spread everywhere else in the world. Keep in mind the final layer of mouse utopia before the mass killings, with the turn from phase C to phase D, is total stagnation and fossilization. The mouse colony stops doing anything as the mice become spiritually dead, and their actions totally hollow. Then, like a switch, the mice start murdering one another as they realize no one will stop them. I don't know how or when this will happen. I do know that nothing will stop it, and people will realize that at some point. It could start next week for all I know. All we need is a crisis in confidence. Everything else in Mouse Utopia has already occurred except the layer where the mice murder each other. Expecting this to have any other outcome would be insane. Well, this entire trajectory has already occurred perfectly with what the Mouse Utopia experiment would say. I want to say as a final message that I'm still in the saddle and I'm willing to do whatever it takes so that we live through this. Peace, Rudyard Lynch.